Most modern motorcycles begin with a meeting. How many can we sell? How many parts can we share with another model? Can every dealer service it? Will it pass emissions in every major market? And most importantly, can anybody prove that this strange new idea will make money? There was a period when major motorcycle companies occasionally behaved less like corporations and more like engineering departments with access to corporate money. An engineer could suggest replacing the front fork, adding a turbocharger to the wrong engine, or abandoning pistons altogether. And instead of being escorted out of the building, he might receive a budget. The 5 motorcycles in this video were not all successful. Some were commercial failures. Some solved problems buyers did not know they had. One began as a humiliating racing disaster. And the last bike was so radical that it exposes why the big manufacturers probably could not create it at all. Number 5, the 1982 Honda CX500 Turbo. The original CX500 was a dependable middleweight with a liquid-cooled V-twin, shaft drive, and a reputation for surviving the sort of daily use that destroys more glamorous motorcycles. It was practical, slightly odd-looking, and not the obvious starting point for a technological moonshot. Honda looked at it and decided it needed a turbocharger. The idea was simple enough to explain: give a 500cc motorcycle the performance of a much larger engine. Actually doing it was viciously difficult. A small engine produces little exhaust energy at low speed, so the turbo takes time to wake up. When boost finally arrives, power can come much faster than the rider expects. On an early 80s motorcycle, that can become a personality test. Honda did not merely attach a turbo kit and hope. The CX500 Turbo combined forced induction with computer-controlled fuel injection and ignition. The Science Museum describes it as the first motorcycle to bring those systems together. Honda mounted the turbocharger in front of the engine and surrounded the project with sensors, warning systems, revised brakes, different suspension, and bodywork that looked like it had arrived from the next decade. And it worked. It was fast, complicated, expensive, and unmistakably experimental. Honda replaced it with the smoother, stronger CX650 Turbo for 1983, and then the whole idea disappeared. Today, try proposing a unique turbo system for a middleweight tourer, complete with special plumbing, heat control, dealer training, and warranty risk. The meeting would be over before the coffee cooled. Number 4, the 1993 Yamaha GTS1000. Look at almost any motorcycle from the side, and one component has survived practically every technological revolution: the telescopic front fork. It bends, it changes geometry under braking, and it has to handle steering, suspension, and braking loads at the same time. Engineers have complained about those compromises for decades. Yamaha was one of the few major manufacturers willing to replace it. The GTS1000 used a single-sided front swing arm derived from James Parker's rad concept. Steering and suspension movement were separated instead of being forced through 2 sliding fork tubes. The front wheel moved through a linkage while a steering arm turned it. Around that system, Yamaha built a rigid, omega-shaped aluminum frame that curved around the engine. This was not a fragile concept bike. The GTS had fuel injection, a 20-valve inline 4, a 3-way catalytic converter, and available ABS. It was meant to cross states with luggage. The front end gave the bike unusual stability under braking. It also gave dealers, mechanics, and customers something unfamiliar to understand. The GTS was heavy, visually strange, and expensive. Most riders could look at a normal fork and understand it immediately. Yamaha was asking them to pay more for a solution whose advantage became clearest only after they had already bought the motorcycle. That is a brutal sales problem. The GTS required unique castings, steering hardware, service training, and a long explanation on the showroom floor. It did not merely contain new technology. It challenged everything the customer already trusted. Yamaha proved the idea could work. The market proved that working was not enough. Number 3. The Suzuki RE5. Every conventional motorcycle engine turns the up and down movement of pistons into rotation. A rotary engine begins with rotation and stays there. No reciprocating pistons and no conventional valvetrain. Just a triangular rotor moving inside an unusually shaped chamber. In theory, it sounds perfect for a motorcycle. Compact, smooth, and mechanically elegant. Suzuki obtained a license to use NSU Wankel rotary patents in 1970. The company then committed the resources of a major manufacturer to making the idea survive in the real world. The result was the RE5, shown at the Tokyo Motor Show in late 1973 and launched as Suzuki's technical flagship. Its single-rotor engine displaced 497 cc by the official measurement, but rotary displacement comparisons have always started arguments. What did not require debate was the smoothness. Without pistons stopping and reversing direction thousands of times per minute, the RE5 had a character unlike the parallel twins and inline fours parked beside it. But the supposedly simple rotary demanded a complicated motorcycle around it. Heat, sealing, fuel consumption, and extremely hot exhaust gas all needed special attention. Suzuki had created a different engine, then discovered that every supporting system also had to become different. The timing could hardly have been worse. The oil crisis of 1973 pushed buyers toward fuel efficiency just as Suzuki prepared to sell an unfamiliar machine whose main appeal was engineering sophistication. Suzuki's own historical archive says production and sales stopped roughly a year after the debut as demand shifted toward more economical models. That short life is exactly why the RE5 matters. One of Japan's major manufacturers built production tooling, trained dealers, stocked parts, and placed its reputation behind a motorcycle with no pistons. Imagine presenting that business case today. An engine shared with nothing, unfamiliar servicing, difficult emissions development, and customers needing a mechanical lecture before the test ride. If you enjoy stories about the moments engineers briefly escape the accountants, subscribe. Because the next two machines make a rotary, Suzuki look almost reasonable. Number 2, the 1992 Honda NR. The madness began with a racing rule. When Honda returned to Grand Prix racing in 1979, the premier class was dominated by 2-strokes. Honda wanted to compete with a 4-stroke, partly because 4-strokes were woven into the company's engineering identity. The rules allowed no more than 4 cylinders. Honda's engineers wanted the breathing area and valve count of 8. So they asked a question that sounds like a joke. What if one piston could behave like 2 pistons joined together? The answer was an oval. Each cylinder in the NR500 used a long oval piston supported by 2 connecting rods. Above it sat 8 valves and 2 spark plugs. Officially, it remained a V4, but it breathed more like a V8. Nothing about manufacturing it was normal. Round piston rings naturally press against round cylinder walls. An oval ring has straight sections connected to curved ends, and every tiny error creates sealing problems. At high engine speeds, the 2 connecting rods could twist, pull the piston out of alignment, and destroy the assembly. Honda engineers recalled engines disintegrating above 10,000 revolutions per minute while they fought to make the concept live. The NR500's Grand Prix debut at Silverstone was miserable. One bike crashed at the first corner. The other retired with engine trouble. Later, both failed to qualify in France. Honda eventually returned to winning with the conventional 2-stroke NS500. Any normal company would have buried the oval piston there. Honda spent years refining it. In 1992, the company released a road-going 750cc NR with oval pistons, 8 valves, and 2 connecting rods per cylinder, electronic fuel injection, carbon fiber reinforced bodywork, magnesium wheels, and a price of 2 million yen in Japan. This was not an economical way to make a fast 750. It was a decade of engineering stubbornness turned into a showroom motorcycle. The production NR later set 4 FIM speed records in 1993, including an average of 299, 825 kilometers per hour over a flying kilometer in opposite directions. The oval piston never became ordinary. Its value was proving Honda could manufacture the impossible accurately enough to give it a warranty and a license plate. Today, simulation would reveal the cost. Product planning would reveal the tiny market. An accountant would point to an existing engine that made more power for a fraction of the investment. Every objection would be correct, and the NR would never leave the presentation screen. Number 1, the Britten V1000. This bike breaks the premise of the video because a company might dare to build it today, but only if that company barely behaved like a company at all. John Britten and a small team in Christchurch, New Zealand, did not begin with an existing production motorcycle and improve it. They reconsidered almost every major component from first principles. The engine was designed largely from scratch and acted as the fully stressed center of the motorcycle. Carbon fiber and Kevlar formed the upper chassis, swing arm, bodywork, and even the wheels. Double wishbones replaced the conventional fork, while the radiator lived beneath the seat. The finished V1000 weighed about 138 kilograms and produced a claimed 166 horsepower. Only 10 were built. In 1993, one set 4 world speed records for motorcycles of 1,000 cc and under, reaching 302, 705 kilometers per hour through the flying mile. The numbers are extraordinary. The circumstances are more important. Britten had no global dealer network demanding familiar procedures and no future product family waiting to share the engine. When a conventional part seemed wrong, his team could replace the entire idea. That freedom came with brutal limitations: little money, impossible deadlines, and components made by a tiny group of people who had to solve problems themselves. At one early Daytona appearance, the team reportedly turned an empty baked bean can into a temporary muffler just to satisfy officials. The motorcycle led into the first corner and then stopped. They came back. That is the thread connecting every bike here. Not perfection, not sales success. The willingness to come back after the idea embarrassed you. Modern motorcycles are safer, cleaner, faster, and more reliable than these machines. The problem is not that engineering became worse. The problem is that failure became easier to predict. Data can show that customers will not pay for an unfamiliar front suspension. Regulations can show how expensive a rotary engine will become. Simulations can reveal that an oval piston is a terrible use of money before anybody machines the first one. That knowledge protects companies from failure. It also protects them from creating motorcycles nobody knew they wanted. So which machine deserves the most respect? The one that worked, the one that failed, or the one whose engineers refused to understand the difference? Tell us in the comments. And tell us what motorcycle should be on part 2. Because history is full of machines that never should have reached production, and we are lucky somebody ignored that fact.